Kia ora koutou katoa and welcome Territory 3 community to our first T3 webinar of 2022. I hope you're feeling relaxed and refreshed, and we're very excited to kick the year off to provide these webinars courtesy of Territory 3 and only due to the support of our sponsors, the New Zealand Trade Enterprise, K1W1, Evander Management, Jasmine Investments, Bank of New Zealand, and Amazon Web Services. So to kick the year off, I'm delighted to have Rebecca Freeman with us. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Coming in from a different location this time. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. Previously located in San Francisco, but now moved into the New Zealand context. So welcome again from a New Zealander point of view. And we'll ask a few questions about that soon. So folks, this is very much what we'd call a specialist session in terms of any early or any really stage questions you have about the immigration trail. And actually, we were just talking prior to coming on the webinar, Rebecca's also doing some very cool stuff around actually inbound and some ideas there. So we might chat about that later as well, because I know, speaking to a number of you late last year, the idea of trying to attract people from the USA into the New Zealand context to boost that talent gap was something that was on your minds. So just a couple of household hygiene issues. Obviously, we've got the chat live. We love to see your comments coming through. Rebecca, don't worry too much about that. I'll keep an eye on them in case there's anything we want to bring into the conversation. And of course, for specific questions that you would like answered within the hour, if you could just use the Q&A section that should be on the bottom of your screen for Zoom. So I'll be looking at that, and we'll take a question and answer break at about the 30-minute mark, and then another one about 10 minutes before we close, just to make sure that we do get any specifics. And in fact, today we've had a question come in pre-webinar to answer as well. So Rebecca, over to you. I'd love you to remind some of those who haven't been on a webinar with you as a guest before about what you're up to and who you are, and then we'll rip into things.
All right, so thank you for having me. I'm excited to kick off this year. So my name is Rebecca Freeman. I'm an immigration attorney, and my company is San Francisco Law Group. And I was based in San Francisco until mid-2020, related to COVID. My family and I made the move to Queenstown. We intended it to be a short-term thing, and we sort of fell in love with it. And so here we are, no plans to leave. My husband is from Nelson. That's how we were able to get around the border closures. And so I continue to work remotely. I have a team in the US, and I am working from lovely Queenstown. It's a bit rainy today, but very nice.
Awesome, and can't go without mentioning your husband is also the inaugural manager of the Kiwi landing pad, which is the former name of Territory 3. So hi to James if he's out the back there somewhere. That's
right. Nah, he's swimming at the moment, but he's training for a open water swim.
Lovely. So look, thank you for that. And I think really just, it's been a while since we spoke, and my goodness, it would be a much longer webinar if we talked about a lot of the changes and things that have happened in the market since then. But really interested just to kick off for the audience, you know, from what you recall of the key points and the key process of getting established from an immigration point of view in the US. What's changed, the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of the landscape for making that shift for you, your company, and or other team members of that?
So last time, so I'll try to give a sort of very brief overview of the US immigration framework. So generally, it has been historically a little bit more challenging in the context of entrepreneurs, because the US immigration system is really more organized around employer, employee, you know, family member, husband, wife, parent, child, whatever. And so that's been sort of a difficulty. And then the Trump administration came in and made things very challenging, not only for, you know, Muslim nationality and sort of low-skilled workers, but also for high-skilled and entrepreneurs, which was a little bit surprising and not great from my perspective. One light in that sort of dark 4-year period was the E2 visa, E1, E2, so that's either for people, E1 is significant trade with the US and E2 is for investors. So formerly New Zealand didn't have access to that visa because they were not signed to that treaty. So that happened in 2018, I want to say. So fast forward to Biden taking office January 2021. Happily, we've started to unravel a number of the negative policies, executive orders, et cetera. However, there have been significant delays, especially around COVID, that are very hard to get around. So we're seeing the longest processing times that I can think of in my, more than decade practicing immigration law. For most of 2020, the majority of the Department of State was shut. So, the places where they actually issue you visas just closed. And so obviously the demand hasn't gone down, so people have backed up, and it's just, so sort of the lingering effects. There were negative policy kind of changes during the last administration, compounded by COVID. Here we are now trying to undig from that, but there are still, unfortunately, some significant delays in processing. I would say that's a bit of an update. And then because it is a transactional US immigration, unless you're defending someone who's overstayed, so my practice wouldn't involve going in front of a judge. So my work has been, you mentioned from my moving from San Francisco to Queenstown, very much the same. It's a 3-hour difference now, but pretty straightforward. One of my attorneys is in Chicago, and she was just saying there's a massive storm, and she maybe can or maybe cannot get to FedEx to drop off filing. So we actually still have to file with paper.
Right.
I don't know why, but you actually still. So anyway, this was, can she get out on the street? They're expecting 1 to 2 feet of snow, I guess, in the next, anyway. So there you have it. It's much the same. Some delays, very happy to be in Queenstown. It's been quite interesting.
Yes, I bet. And so just in terms of that journey, let's say I'm a founder right today, my business has got to the point where we're well and truly validated. We've seen some signals in the US. I want to start that process. I'm committed to spending some time. We've identified the US as a large and significant market, so we want to actually put boots on the ground, as they say. What sort of time frame and what sort of preparation should I be thinking about to sort of have a realistic expectation of when I'd actually be able to book my ticket?
Oh my, don't book the ticket until you have the visa in hand. That's the first thing I would say. Generally, non-immigrant visas will go faster. You could be thinking of a time frame of months, as opposed to if you're looking for a green card, that's a time frame of potentially years. This again is coming on, all of these additional delays, but there have been some, there has been a recognition that entrepreneurs do not fit that typical employee-employer relationship that is historically how USCIS looks at foreign nationals. So there is a new program. I think I mentioned to you, it came out in June 2021. That's the International Entrepreneur Parole rule. The word is parole. It doesn't have anything criminal to do with it. I don't know why that's the term, but that's what it is. It means you can go out into the US and you have work authorization, but it's not a status. So that is, it was introduced during the Obama administration, frozen during the Trump administration, now recently back. I am not aware of any of those cases being adjudicated yet, and they have not promised a timeline. This is going to your question about timeline. This is the hardest thing to answer. Back in October of 2020, Congress directed USCIS, that's the Immigration Service, to expand premium processing. Premium processing allows a faster adjudication. You have to pay more, and then you get a turnaround within 15 business days. But we're still waiting for that program expansion. All of these processes, they have to go through, public comment periods, and then they finally publish final regulations, and it's just lengthy. So International Entrepreneur Parole, I don't know. I'm hopeful that premium processing will become available and that that will be something that gets adjudicated faster. Something that's happened within the last week, actually, there are new regulations related to the national interest waiver and to the L1a visa for extraordinary ability. Those are two that can also be applicable to the entrepreneur. And that's because those don't require exactly that employer-employee relationship necessarily. So the national interest waiver, again, that's another one that doesn't have premium processing right now. Hopefully that gets added soon. And the O can be processed with premium processing. That's basically a 2-week plus 2-3 week turnaround. And then there's the E2, and that's for, if you've made a significant investment in a company, and that turnaround can be, you can premium process that as well, so you can have the fast turnaround. So that is to say, turnarounds can be anywhere from a couple months to well over a year, depending on what track you're going down. And that really is very dependent on how is the company formed, how is it held, how is it capitalized, the nationality of the investors, the nationality of the individuals. So there are many, many different moving pieces that you have to consider before you decide what track you're going to be pursuing, for which particular visa.
And so just so I understand it correctly, the E2 in terms of investor, that would be investment into a US company? Is that how it works?
Exactly. So either it can be related to a company that already exists in, for example, New Zealand, or it can be a brand new thing.
Right.
And the point is that the investment is meant to come out of the pockets of the investor.
Right.
That, again, doesn't really jive with an entrepreneur who probably has some funding already. I mean, of course, it would work in the bootstrapping context, but we are working to massage applications and help USCIS understand that control of the business can indicate sort of that ownership percentage as well.
Right, right. And so I guess just two scenarios in terms of, I think, where a lot of our founders are at. So you've got one where someone's going to target the full relocation. They're just going for it. They're going to basically be primarily establishing themselves, if available from an immigration point of view, in the US. And then I guess you've got the other one, which I think is probably more common, where it's like, look, I've got to be there at least 5, 6+ times this year, and I know that the 90-day sort of traditional waiver scenario is not going to move. So looking at those two paths, do you go down the same type of visa, or what would you be suggesting to people around those two personas?
So with the ESTA, you can come and go quite a bit. It's true that you only get 90 days at a time, and it's probably preferable not to use all of those at once. You don't want to, for example, it won't work if your strategy is stay 90 days, go to Mexico for a weekend, stay 90 days, go to Mexico for a weekend. That won't work. It might work the first time, maybe the second. This is not an ongoing strategy. Yeah. But you can start in that way if, for example, you need to go to the US because you're taking meetings, you're raising funds, you're interviewing for prospective employees, you're negotiating contracts. That sort of thing would be acceptable on the ESTA. But again, you don't want to, that should be for business meetings, essentially. A week here, 2 weeks there, maybe even 3 weeks, but that shouldn't be sort of you're not meant to be working on the ESTA, if that makes sense. But often what I see is that people will be pursuing various different things at a time. So you may be traveling on the ESTA whilst in the background getting all of your documentation ready for the E2, for example. Or maybe you're putting together your package for, to make a case that you're an outstanding individual, and that's going to take some time. And so maybe during the time that you're doing that, you are, coming and going on ESTA. Does that answer the question? Yeah,
I think so. Yeah. And then if you're really, looking to establish, it's the same. You're targeting a different category of visa for that.
So there's a concept of intent with US immigration. And so that is related to your intention to either be a temporary person in the US or a long-term person, i.e. someone who has permanent residence, a green card holder. So there are some non-immigrant statuses that do not allow for dual intent, meaning if you enter as, for example, if you enter as an E2, you must only have the intent to be a non-immigrant, which means you have the intent to leave at the conclusion of whatever project it is that you're engaged in the US. However, intentions can change. So, you know, that doesn't mean that if you enter in an E2, you cannot become a green card later. You can become a permanent resident later, but you need to be careful about managing your intent. So for example, the H-1B visa allows for dual intent. So in that case, and speaking of the H-1B, that lottery, the registration for the lottery opens in March. So March 1st, less than a month away to get those petitions in. So let's say you're chosen for the H-1B. At the same time as entering in the H-1B and working on the H-1B, you can be pursuing the green card process because H-1B allows for dual intent.
Right.
Whereas with the E2, you don't want to end up in a situation where you need to renew the E2, but you have already demonstrated immigrant intent. So it's a question of making sure the timing is right in that case.
Yeah.
And yeah, and you should be clear with your intentions. And I think fair enough to, if you're coming as an E2, you haven't lived in the US before, you don't know how it's going to be, you don't know how your family's going to like it. Fair enough that it's, you know, you have a temporary idea about it initially, and that might progress into a more permanent situation later, and that's okay.
Interesting. Yeah, quite a lot to think about in terms of your strategy, isn't there, in terms of the path that you go down.
There's something else that I just want to mention this so that I don't forget it. It is a little bit outside of my area, but it's important to consider the tax implications.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
And I just want to make sure we don't let that one go. So if you're a temporary, you know, on a non-immigrant visa and you're in the US, you do, of course, you have to pay taxes. And there's a tax treaty between the US and New Zealand. But you should be aware that once you've held the green card for, I believe it's 8 years out of 15. Again, this is, you have to go to a CPA for this. You end up in a situation where you have a lifetime obligation then to file returns. And then if you want to exit that lifetime obligation, you have an exit tax. There's the Hart Taxation Act. Again, I'm speaking about that which is beyond my area.
Yeah.
But it's to flag definitely before you take that step to be permanent, you do want to have a conversation with an accountant who specializes in foreign nationals and, you know, how those tax consequences interact between the home country and the US and blah, blah, blah. The US also is unusual in that it requires me, for example, I have not lived in the US for, you know, a year and a half, but I still have the tax obligation in the United States, not only federally, but also in California, also for my business entity. Very painful, very annoying. So this is like taxes, a big pain in the butt to think about and sort out so that you know what you're getting into. So it's not a nasty surprise.
Yeah, that's great. Great perspective on that, and advice from a tax professional is something that we always suggest to our founders to do. And also to your point, you know, it's not just about dealing with the federal government. There's also the state aspect as well in terms of where you're going to establish not just your business, but I think also your individual presence, right? So
yeah, right. And so again, a bit outside, you know, this would be more corporate attorney role, but you know, if you're interested in funding, you're going to need the Delaware entity formation. But then if you're going to be operating in, say, California, you need to register as a foreign company, not foreign as in not US, foreign as in outside of California.
Yeah. Again,
kind of outside. Anyway, you need a whole team, accountants, corporate attorneys, etc.
Yeah, that's quite complicated. We've got a question from Ratnakar. Thank you for that. He's a founder of a tech business, 10 years of successful operations in New Zealand, Singapore, and Australia. In US markets, the next priority. He's asking, would L1a be a recommended option?
Yes. So the L1a, we haven't mentioned that. That is for individuals who've worked at least 1 year within the last 3 for an entity that is related to a US entity, even if it's a brand new one, related as in affiliate, subsidiary, parent, that there's some ownership relationship. And so the other requirement with the L is that both entities continue operating. So if it is that you're picking up entirely, you're leaving New Zealand altogether and you're moving to the US, then the L wouldn't work, because you need the foreign country, in this case, the New Zealand company, say, to continue operating, in addition to the US company. So L1a can be used for a brand new company that you're just setting up in the US, or it can be for an already established US company. As to the specifics, Ratnakar, of your situation, it will of course come down to the specifics of your business. How many employees you have, what kind of funding, how it's been capitalized, what your goals are, et cetera, et cetera. I see in the chat, you've also mentioned the EB1C, that's for the multinational manager executive role. So this is sort of a similar track to the L1a. Stay with me. The L1a is a non-immigrant visa. So that's for someone who's been that 1 year within the last 3, at least, in a company affiliated with the US company. That's a faster process because it's non-immigrant. That'll get you in the door. Because it has dual intent, you could also pursue that EB1C multinational manager path at the same time. It's going to take longer. So if your idea is to basically get there as soon as you can, L1a followed shortly by EB1C if you want. I want to mention something else, which is that the green card is based on country of birth, not country of nationality. So say you were born in Australia, but you have New Zealand citizenship. Your visa will be counted against the number of visas available for Australia. For example, as between Australia and New Zealand, it's no difference. They both send very few people. However, if your country of birth is either China or India, you may be looking at a long backup. Those are obviously larger populations, and they tend to have just long waits.
Interesting. Gosh, I would never have thought that.
Yeah.
It's a useless observation, but you've probably bought school books for your kids this year. This visa listing sounds very familiar to me in terms of that list of textbooks and books for school. How many visas?
I just picked up school books for the new school year yesterday.
Any of them?
Brand new school.
Exactly.
I'm very excited. It has top air filtration. It's the new, let me see this. So it's Te Kura Whakatipu Wakarau. What? I'm still working on Maori, but get there. Anthony
McNaughton has a question. Has there been any progress re-reinstatement of the EB5 visas? And what is the typical minimum investment requirement? And is investment limited to the state you intend to live in?
Yeah, EB5 has been all over the place. So right now, regional centers are not, you cannot access EB5 via regional center, although maybe that portion of the legislation will be renewed. So right now, and then for a while under the Trump administration, the dollar amounts of investment had gone from 500,000 and $1 million to 900,000 and 1.8 million. Then those numbers were dropped back to the 500,000 and the 1 million. But at the moment for EB5, it would need to be a direct investment, not via a regional center. Does that answer the question to who?
And there was just a bit about the state, whether there was a state impact in terms of where you're establishing.
Oh, so again, that's they changed a bit the definition of the underserved community. The typically the opportunity centers that have sort of lower employment. They've changed how that's being determined, and so you'd have to look specifically. Location. Yes, your location matters, but it's not a statewide thing. It's a much smaller.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Is there a list of those somewhere that you can see, or do you just have to go into each individual? How do you identify some of those opportunity areas?
I haven't looked at this very recently. I don't. I'm not 100%. I think USCIS comes back and tells you if it qualifies or not. I would need to come back to you on this.
Okay, interesting. Siobhan has a question. Hi, Siobhan. Hi, Rebecca. She loves your wallpaper, and she also has an E2 that she got in November.
That is me right there.
Oh, that's you on the horse.
That's me. Central Otago, loving it down here.
Very cool. That's not the horse you had the accident with, is it?
Nope, different horse.
Okay. Siobhan got an E2 in November 2019 with a 5-year term. She's got 3 years left before it expires, but the question is, for people whose E2 expired during COVID, is it difficult to renew or extend?
Yes and no. So for the E2 and the E3, which I'll just mention, you probably, maybe some of you are Australian citizens as well, and or maybe you've heard of the E3. It's this really nice visa Australians have access to, and you don't at the moment. So those are visas that you can get directly to consulate, which means that you don't have to go through USCIS, which is expensive, a bit painful, potentially has a higher level of scrutiny. So you can, and historically, people who are renewing E2s and E3s, they just go directly to the consulate. However, with these huge delays that we've been seeing and problems with the Department of State, and just sort of whack-a-mole, trying to find a consulate that will take your, that will actually adjudicate your request, people have been extending within the country, within the United States, which you can absolutely do. It's just not something that people historically did so much. So there is a process to extend your E2 within the US. You can do that, but in the moment that you leave the US, you will need to get it, you will eventually need a consular appointment to get a new visa stamped in your passport if you want to come back in, because there's a distinction between having the visa in your passport. That's just really a travel document. It allows you to come and go. And then your I-94 is actually evidence of your authorization to be in the US. So there are two different things. So just having your approval, your E2 approval, doesn't mean that you can come and go and travel on that E2. You also, in your passport, need the E2 visa to come and go. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. Yeah, it provoked a question for me around the E3, just back to what you said about country of birth. So is an E3 country of birth or the passport?
It is not.
Yeah. It's
just citizenship. So that, I don't know why they make these. And so for a green card, country of birth matters. For non-immigrant, country of birth does not matter.
Cool. And Ratnika, I just had a follow-up, just a question on providing an indication for the L1a, if you're able to. I'm
not quite, can you elaborate? I'm not quite sure, or did you?
I think we covered in his last question, the EB1C.
Yeah, and the L1a.
And the L1a, and then you're just asking in regards to the L1c.
So the L1a is the non-immigrant one,
yeah,
and the EB1C is the immigrant one. And they are similar in that they have, processing time. Okay, fine. Yes, you can, with the L1a, you can use premium processing. That's a 15 working day turnaround.
And what sort of premium do they charge for that? Just out of interest?
It's a scandal. Well, it used to be so much less. Trump, obviously, yes, it increased massively. Used to be 1,250, I think, maybe. It's now 2,500.
Wow.
So I don't create these fees. It is what it is.
Yeah, and that's all the questions we have for now. And it sort of provoked a question just with that last piece. Yeah, what should you be budgeting for this for an individual to go through the process? Obviously, the company's got to have an idea of what the whole establishment's going to cost. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
So filing fees are one thing, legal fees are another thing. Then, of course, there are the travel fees and the fees associated with, for example, having a physical location. So even though most companies now are accepting either fully remote or some sort of mishmash or more freedom with location, USCIS is still somewhat stuck on the idea that you need a physical location. So for example, with the L1a, you would need at least a WeWork or Regis or something like that. So that's another fee that's associated. All of the fees are completely dependent on what kind of path you're pursuing. Non-immigrant visas will tend to be less because you can do them more quickly. It requires less work, fewer hours, and the filing fees can really range. So from, say only $460 to, as a filing fee total, to, for example, as much as almost $5,000 filing fees, depending on what you're applying for, depending on whether you want premium processing or not, depending on how many employees you have, the filing fees change. So that is extremely variable. And the legal fees as well, are dependent on how complicated, how lengthy the process. So E3s are probably among the cheapest. Again, I know that's not for New Zealand, but your cousins over there, that could be sort of in the $2,500 range. Whereas if you're wanting some of the more complicated green card processes, that could be, in excess of $10,000. So it's—
These are US dollars, not New Zealand pesos?
US dollars. So it's quite a big range depending on what you're after. And, all the individual characteristics related to the business.
What sort of check-in, if any, of these visas do you have in respect to the process? And you basically get it for the term and there's no more questions, or you might get pulled out for some further questions at the border, or they have random spot checks on these things. How does that sort of—
Yeah, so you've mentioned a couple points where you can be questioned. So of course, so let's see how to do this. Some petitions or some applications you can just make directly at the consulate. And so that skips a step. But usually most petitions or applications are going to need to start in the US. They may or may not need to go through the Department of Labor first, or they may go directly to USCIS. But so most applications / petitions will start in the US with either or both Department of Labor and USCIS. Then they will be sent to the consulate. Then that's the next stage where you go to the Department of State, you go to your consular officer and you say, look, I have my approval from USCIS. Now I need the travel document to come into the country. So then at that point, assuming everything is good, stamp, give you back your passport. Now you have the opportunity to enter. So again, once you get to the, you've had your long journey, you've waited in line, now you're waiting for the Customs and Border Protection person to review you. There's another opportunity for them to admit you or reject you. Rejections are super uncommon, especially if you're doing things properly. It's, if you held a green card in the past, you haven't been in the US in 5 years, and you rock up with your green card and you say, I'm a permanent resident, you're definitely going to be put in secondary inspection for that, But if you are working with an immigration attorney and things are basically, you've gone through these processes, first, Department of Labor, then USCIS, then Department of State, and then you come in, none of those are likely to be terribly problematic. Finally, there are sometimes site checks. The Department of Labor conducts these at random and, to make sure that the conditions are as promised with the initial petitions and applications. So there are a number of different stages where you could potentially get tripped up. But, if you have reasonably good advice, you shouldn't be running into those problems.
Cool. And just a general question, again, sort of similar to the points made, very much a perspective rather than advice on tax. From what you're seeing and hearing with your network in the US, I mean, what would be your perspective on what is worth looking at currently as a founder to actually relocate or spend significant time in the US? Because I guess you've got everyone pretty familiar with remote working, and from what I'm hearing, a lot of people in the US pretty much work remotely almost permanently. But even more significant, I think, for us looking to sort of develop business, they have a preference not to meet in person just because of the heightened state of of concern around, COVID status and so forth. So just interested in your perspective, again, not as a specialist on that side, but just from what you're seeing and hearing.
Yeah, I think all of that is true. The fact that there's quite a bit more willingness to do remote work. What I am seeing, though, is that companies, although they're quite open to remote, they're not wanting international remote. They still want someone continental US. And I think that is in part because of the time zones, and also in part because of there are all kinds of additional complications vis-a-vis taxes and employee benefits and sort of HR issues around having someone on payroll. Having an employee that is not physically in the US is really hard for companies, and especially companies that are using PEOs. My experience with the PEOs is that they're just flummoxed by working out how to do payroll for someone who is offshore,
right?
And they don't like it and they don't want to do it. So yes, whereas I think remote work is quite a bit more accepted and cool in this time period. I think it's still, there still is that idea that that it should be somewhere at least within the US. And so, but I suppose, and I think that probably is related to fundraising as well. Because I think, and it doesn't matter maybe the location within the US, but I think the investors want at least the assurance that the individual could physically be in the US should that be needed. And I think there's more reticence to fund someone who's just, even if they do have that Delaware corporation, it does seem to me, and again, this is anecdotal, it does seem that there's still a preference for somewhere within the United States.
Yeah, and that sort of was prompting me when you're talking about PEOs, and for those not familiar, it's pretty common US process of smaller companies getting aggregate benefits as a member of a PEO, which means that,
I think it stands for Professional Employer Organization.
Yeah. So something well worth Googling for founders looking at that type of thing, because they basically aggregate and make much more cost-effective things like payroll and the things that US.
Oh, that's another thing. We don't have healthcare, or our system is very different. And for whatever reason, and I don't actually know the reason, in the US, healthcare is quite tied to employment, which is kind of a mystery. I don't know. I mean, it seems a bit stupid, but that is the case. So if you're going to hire people, you can expect people to be, that you will be providing their healthcare, which might be a bit of a shock.
Yeah.
But that is what it is.
PEOs are really the only way I've ever seen to make that an effective proposition for 1 or 2 employees in the US, because they aggregate, they represent to the health companies, the insurance companies, like they were a 5,000 employee company, and you were just 3 of those employees. So yeah, well worth looking into. But it did also just raise the question, I think, to clarify for folks in terms of what you've seen, Rebecca, the applications, and obviously there's some different paths where this might actually be essential, but a US incorporated company versus just coming straight into work and develop without that subsidiary and just running off a New Zealand company. Is there any major difference or thoughts?
Yeah, there are some visas that would allow that. For example, I mean, I think you'll have, if you're trying to raise funds, then I don't think that's a good idea. Again, just anecdotally. But, for example, the E1 visa is for people who have significant trade. So if you have a business and your main trade partner is in the US, then you can get an E1 based on that New Zealand company that's doing most of its trade with the US. So not every single status requires a US company, but most do. Because of that employer-employee sort of framework, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally.
I wanted to mention, we got some time before, there was a question from someone about having different nationalities.
Oh yes, that was actually pre the webinar. And apologies, I've just lost the title of to who it was from, but the question was, are there any particular US immigration details to take into account for a founder if they hold 2 passports, and in this case, one for New Zealand and one for the EU or from the EU.
Yeah. So there are some things. So I'll put the EU to the side for the moment. There are 5 countries that have special visas because those countries did whatever special negotiation they did. They did some kind of deal. So the countries that are special are Canada, Mexico, Chile, Singapore, and Australia. So if you happen to have a passport from one of those countries, good on you. You have an easier and less costly route. The thing about having any other passports, including the EU, any of the EU countries, it just gives you more options as far as where you might be able to process, because consulates are really, especially right now, as I said, terribly backed up and really not wanting to schedule appointments for what they call third country nationals. So say you're from New Zealand, you're trying to get to the US, but there are no appointments at Auckland. Where can you go? You'll be a third country national somewhere else. And so if you actually hold a passport in Germany, or, then you're much more likely that Frankfurt will say, okay, yes, we'll see you. For example, if you just go and you say, well, I'm a Kiwi and I have no ties to Germany, but I see that you have some, appointment availability. So in that way, having an additional passport can be useful. And then again, country of birth is relevant for the green card, whereas just nationality is relevant for the non-immigrant visa. And country of birth really is only a problem if you're born in China or India, as far as backlogs go.
Yeah. And just my own clarification, or maybe some of our viewers, but there is only Auckland in New Zealand that you can actually engage with the US consulate.
Yeah. Although they do US citizen services, they do little road shows, or they did before, kind of travel around. I don't think they've been doing that lately. We have to renew a passport for one of our daughters. And yes, they had sort of touring around the countries, to do those things, and that's been delayed as far as I know.
Cool, thank you. So we've got about 15 minutes to run, and I wanted to sort of, if there are no other sort of direct immigration questions for Rebecca, just flip to certainly something that's intriguing me that Rebecca has a really interesting view on for a couple of reasons. And this is more in what we call founder life than it is around immigration, because you were looking at some new ventures that I'll let you share whatever you're comfortable with, because I know they're not sort of quite public yet, but really around this issue I mentioned at the start of what's it like from a US perspective, either as an investor, founder, or potential employee, coming and trying to establish immigration status in New Zealand from the US?
So I will say, since I've been here and since I do practice immigration law, I have had a flood of inquiries from my US friends, colleagues, friends of friends, associates, just a huge number of people saying, oh my God, I got to get out of here. I cannot tolerate this. How do I get to New Zealand? It seems so sensible. Your politics seem so sensible. Things seem so reasonable. And maybe internally there's quite a bit of unhappiness about how COVID is being handled, or maybe there was happiness initially and maybe now there's unhappiness, but the lived experiences, at least of my friends, and especially people who have young children, it has been very, very dark. And there's a great desire to go to New Zealand. I think the searches, how to move to New Zealand, massively, Google's spike of searches, on the, in the 2016 November, whatever, November 3rd, whatever it was, the election. So there certainly is a desire, absolutely, there's a desire for highly skilled Bay Area and further on people to make a move like the move that we made. And we've been really happy with just, personally, anecdotally, our children have done really well here. And I think this is this is an opinion of one. My opinion is this is a better place to raise children than in the Bay Area. Take it with a grain of salt. That's my opinion.
Yeah, interesting. And I think it'd be worth, if you're open to it, just sort of sharing, because I know had a number of discussions with folks also about, what is going on when it actually happens with these visas that were specifically focused around mainly Americans, but offshore folks actually.
Oh, the investor.
Yeah, going down.
Okay, so in response to this flood of people saying, how do I get to New Zealand? I put my head together with another, she's dual qualified, a US, we actually went to law school together, but we did not know each other in law school, but same time, total overlap. We now live 5 minutes away from each other. Oh. It's a New Zealand story, very small. And so anyway, she's a dual qualified attorney, qualified in the US, qualified here. She too had had a number of people saying, now, how do I get to New Zealand? So we decided, okay, we're going to do this. There's a need for this. We'll create a business around it. And moreover, we will support not just the immigration piece, but the sort of professional advisor piece, because there are a number of things that are different that you just wouldn't expect, even down to how buying real estate works. You don't have buyer's agents. There are just a number of things where we thought, my immediate family, we sort of stumbled over a number of things. I mentioned the tax issue, but, working with attorneys here, working with accountants here, things are different. My husband had been gone for 18 years when he returned. So he had all these ideas about New Zealand. It was quite interesting. He was, New Zealand healthcare, it's the best thing in the world, US is shitty healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it turns out he left New Zealand when he was a strapping young 20-something. He'd never had any medical issues or any, so of course he thought the medical system was great. So we have encountered differences. So the idea around that move to newzealand.com was to provide not only the immigration piece, but also the support around the professional services that you would need to sort of make your life work as a transnational person. That is kind of on the back burner right now, as we heard, okay, the $3 million investor and the $10 million investor, those amounts are going away. Maybe the $3 million is going away, or maybe we have, the $10 million will stay and with an increased amount. It's quite unclear right now. You have many more ties into the government, so maybe you have a better sense of where that is right now. But from my perspective, it seems that can is just getting kicked. There are so many other more critical issues. It doesn't seem like the government is looking at that right now. But that's a question for you. Do you know what's happening with it?
I've got a little bit of insight, but I think your summary is probably pretty accurate. But just for the folks, for a bit of context, so there's two aspects to these investor visas that I think are interesting to founders. One is that the types of people that a lot of us have been looking for ventures as board members or advisors, particularly with US experience. There's possibly, and the numbers I heard, Rebecca, there's probably around 400 to 500 sort of applications at various stages already from folks that all got sort of frozen or delayed at the start of COVID. And the 10 million and the 3 million that Rebecca's referring to are the requirements for those two types of visas of investment, like tangible investment into the New Zealand marketplace. And I think there are some broad rules which we're looking at being reviewed as well as to what they could invest in. But the bottom line was, I think after 2 years in this sort of staged immigration visa qualification process, those amounts, depending on which visa you had, the 3 million or the 10 million, had to be applied into the New Zealand marketplace. So obviously around that sort of seed investment, early stage investment, plus the fact that a lot of these folks who have that sort of cash are, very interesting from the point of view of advice or information into particular networks in the US, is something that, from a Territory 3 point of view, we've tracked pretty closely because, as we know, it's not necessarily just always about capital, it's also smart capital. And it seems like when this actually comes back to life in whatever form, to Rebecca's point, it will be a group of people who will be coming out here on a more regular basis when we address the border issues they'll be going through their qualification process of establishment, i.e. sort of, being resident here for periods of time, but they'll also be looking for projects and investments to make to sort of carry them through that process, which I think is an interesting thing to stay abreast of. To your point, Rebecca, there's not much more to it than that because it's all under review, I think, but it's worth mentioning.
It's frustrating. I have, yes, remind me, there's a person I want to introduce you to. He would be very well suited to, anyway, remind me, I need to introduce you to someone. He wants to come to New Zealand, and I think he would be a very useful mentor and / investor type.
Cool. Well, there we go. Live example of the power of the Territory 3 community.
Yes. Yeah.
So just in terms of what we covered around the immigration, making sure we're sort of about 9 minutes from finished, folks. So if you do have any other burning questions, please put them in the Q&A. It frustrates me when people say, oh, I wish I had asked this or that. Well, it's that time now.
You can also, I can put my email in here, people are quite, you're very welcome to email me.
Thank you for that. And I guess while you're doing that, my last sort of main question is probably future focused in terms of not necessarily something that's happened or has been announced that's happening, but anything, with founders here looking to start a strategy or continue a strategy of establishment and immigration into the US for themselves or part of their team. Anything else you think this year, if we cap it to sort of 2022, that is going to be considered or happen in that context that they should be thinking about?
I do think the Biden administration has made immigration a focus. And is does recognize, and if you want to follow, there's one Congresswoman, Zoe Lofgren. Immigration is her whole, she's always putting forward, she's a Silicon Valley congressperson. So she's always putting forward, look, we're losing, we're falling behind. We need visas for entrepreneurs. We need to make these changes. So if you if you wanted to do a Google News alert sort of thing, put in Zoe Lofgren, that will kind of keep you up to date on what legislation might be coming through. Understand also that US lawmaking is sausage making. It takes a long time, it's ugly. And so, just because a bill is passed in the House doesn't mean it will be passed in the Senate, vice versa. So, just that something has been proposed doesn't mean necessarily it's going to come to pass. There are many things that are proposed and then sort of die, on the House floor, whatever it is. The sort of more generally in terms of thinking of how to position yourself, I would just note that I think I mentioned this to you, sort of the Theranos people, the Elizabeth Holmes types, massive overpromising, into literal fraud, or the WeWork, that kind of situation where you massively overblow what you can do, what product you have, et cetera. I would say Kiwis have the opposite problem. I'm pretty sure every single outstanding individual that I've ever tried to say, okay, we're gonna, you're gonna be an L1a, you'll be an outstanding individual. Every single Kiwi to a person has said, oh, no, I don't. Oh, surely not. No, yeah. I'm not very, no, that's not for me. I'm not outstanding. So,
and we call that the year nah syndrome.
Yeah, nah, right. So, so don't go all the way to Elizabeth Holmes, but you have to go a little bit further than you probably feel comfortable going.
Yeah.
As far as, US, we're superlative. We do everything a bit bigger and slightly fake, maybe. So
100%. Nicely summed up. Diplomatically summed up. Yeah. And I guess to that is, probably should have mentioned it a little bit earlier, but tactically, if someone wants to engage with yourself and your firm, what's the sort of high-level checklist of things that you really need to have ready to go to start the process effectively?
Well, start with an email, see where we are. Happy to do any complimentary consultation with any Kiwi who has questions or even is sort of in an earlier stage looking for contacts. I, of course, know tons of accountants who focus on the cross-border piece. I know a lot of corporate attorneys, many who will focus on entity formation for startups and even, in particular foreign ones, or issues that occur around foreign ownership. So I can certainly help people put their team together. I think it's important to understand it is complex, and there are a lot of, you'll need sort of a whole group of professionals to support you. I can help with that. Feel free to email me. And then as far as what particular things I need, it really depends on the, which visa we're going for. But generally we'll need things about entity formation, how is it capitalized, where did it come from, your nationality, your background, your educational documents, the particulars of the role, who will you be managing, the physical space, as I mentioned. Yeah. Very generally, USCIS is not sort of on board with the idea that people are just fully remote, so you're still going to have to think about a physical space. Yeah. But it really is a pretty individualized process, and so it does require just chat with me. I'll chat with anyone who wants to have a chat.
Cool, thank you. But you mentioned the ones that I was thinking specifically around that physical space. I think it's quite an important one that we often just assume now everyone's back into, remote, or that doesn't matter much. Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us. As usual, it's been insightful, and we'd love to have you on, again this year, because it is a bit of a moving feast in terms of, what to look for, and obviously the context of how many people are interested already to actually start that immigration process. Folks, appreciate you being on the first webinar of the year for Territory 3. Also, hopefully you are all on our email list, and we've just sent out our first newsletter for the year. There's a bunch of info on that, including the webinar speakers for the next month. Fortunately, we have been a sponsor of driving awareness for the Electrify Aotearoa conference, which was a female founder conference due to be in Christchurch this month. Unfortunately, it's been postponed until May, but in recognition of that, and in our newsletter, you will see that our month of webinar speakers for Territory 3 are all female founders and specialists. So have a look at that. We'd love to see you on those as they roll out through to February. Rebecca, thank you so much, and Territory 3 folks, ka kite, and have a great February.
Come visit us next time you're in Queenstown. You must come.
Oh yes. No, I'm probably going to come down there this month. But thanks also, Rebecca, for your offer to just speak to anybody to give them context for the journey ahead. And have a great day.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.